Most people don't really see the janitor. They walk past, step around the mop, maybe even mutter an annoyed, "Excuse me," but rarely do they look twice. For 2 years, that was Renata Silva's entire existence. She arrived at the office before dawn, in a faded blue uniform, pushing a cart that squeaked at every corner. She knew the rhythm of the building better than anyone. The way the elevator always stalled on the 3rd floor, how the air conditioning never worked right in accounting, and which desks accumulated the most crumbs. But no one cared about what she knew. To them, she was just the lady who emptied the trash. That Tuesday morning in March started like any other. Renata had just finished cleaning the kitchen when Danilo Souza, the CEO himself, barreled through the hallway, reeking of cologne and frustration. Without so much as a warning, he shoved her cart aside, nearly toppling her. "Move! There are important people walking here," he barked, eyes blazing. Renata steadied the cart and mumbled a quiet, "I'm sorry, sir," as she stepped back against the wall. She didn't flinch. She was used to that tone, that face. Danilo was 42, ran one of São Paulo's largest import companies, and wore suits more expensive than most people's yearly income. He was known for throwing tantrums in meetings and treating employees like pawns, especially the ones who cleaned his messes. That day, though, something was different. Not just in the air, but in Renata's bones, like a knot twisting inside her chest, warning her that today wouldn't pass like the others. Inside his office, Danilo slammed his briefcase down on the glass desk and shouted for his assistant. "Mariana, how many times do I have to tell these people from cleaning not to get in my way?" Mariana, 35, had worked with him for almost a decade. She'd seen every mood swing, every meltdown, and learned to brace for the worst. "She was just doing her job, senor," she said gently, not making eye contact. "Job? Blocking the hallway is a job now?" He snapped. His voice echoed through the corridor, loud enough for Renata to hear. She stood just outside, quietly rearranging supplies in her cart, pretending not to listen. But she heard every word, every insult, every confirmation that, to Danilo Souza, she was less than a shadow. The day crawled on until a courier arrived with a thick international envelope marked urgent. Danilo tore it open with disinterest, flipping through pages of foreign text and weird symbols. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, disgusted. "Looks like alien language." He shoved the papers toward Mariana, who scanned them and frowned. "Senor, this might be Hungarian. There's a company name, official stamps, and euro amounts." Danilo chuckled. "Hungarian? What, are we in a spy movie now?" But when Mariana pointed to today's date and a number that looked dangerously close to a deadline, Danilo's amusement faded. Panic replaced arrogance. "Find someone to translate this now. I don't care how much it costs." And with that, the dominoes began to fall. What followed was chaos. Mariana called every translation agency she knew, but nobody had a Hungarian translator available on such short notice. Danilo paced the office like a caged animal, cursing under his breath, checking the clock every 5 minutes. "São Paulo has millions of people and not a single damn person speaks Hungarian," he barked, slamming his hand on the desk. The word started spreading like wildfire. A few curious employees wandered in, phones out, trying to decipher the foreign characters with translation apps, each one failing more miserably than the last. Someone joked that it looked like Elvish from Lord of the Rings. The mood shifted from tension to absurdity, and when Amanda from finance warned that legal documents like that often carried deadlines and penalties, Danilo's temper flared. Great. We might lose something important because of a stupid language barrier? That's when his ego kicked in. Standing on a chair like some twisted showman, he held the envelope high above his head and shouted, "I'll give my entire monthly salary to whoever translates this nonsense. 45,000 reais, I swear." The room erupted in laughter. $45,000 was more than most of them earned in a year. Roberto from sales chimed in, "Hell, for that I'd learn Hungarian in 5 minutes." The laughter grew louder, people clapping like it was some comedy act. Danilo basked in the attention, grinning like he owned the world. What none of them realized was that, just a few feet away, still standing silently beside her cart, Renata Silva heard every word, every laugh, every mocking tone. But this time she wasn't going to pretend it didn't matter. Renata took a deep breath. She could feel her pulse rising, her palms sweating. For 2 years, she had tolerated that place. The jokes, the comments, the way people looked right through her. But today she had leverage. She stepped forward, heart pounding but eyes steady, and spoke clearly. "Excuse me, Mr. Danilo," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I can translate those documents." The room fell silent. It was like someone had cut the air. All eyes turned to the janitor who just dared interrupt the boss's performance. Danilo stared at her, blinking like he hadn't heard right. "You what?" "I said I can translate those papers," she repeated, standing tall. "I speak Hungarian." The silence morphed into roars of laughter. Someone nearly fell out of their chair. Danilo doubled over, tears in his eyes. "Did you guys hear that? The cleaning lady thinks she's a translator now," he cackled. "Next she'll tell us she's a spy too." The mocking intensified. Roberto clapped like it was a stand-up routine, but Renata didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Because what none of them knew, what none of them had ever cared to ask, was that before that uniform, before the mop and the gloves, she'd been a university professor, a linguist, and the words on those pages weren't just gibberish to her. They were the keys to something Danilo couldn't even begin to understand. Danilo leaned against his desk, arms crossed, trying to suppress another laugh. "Right, you speak Hungarian," he said with heavy sarcasm, rolling his eyes. "Look, sweetheart, maybe you picked up a few words cleaning embassies, but this is legal stuff. Complicated." He waved the documents like they were confetti. "Go back to your cart before you embarrass yourself." Around him, the laughter resumed, lighter now but still filled with disbelief. Even Mariana, who had always seemed a little more human than the rest, stood frozen, unsure of what to say. Renata didn't move. She didn't shrink away or apologize. She just looked him straight in the eye and said, "You promised your salary to whoever could translate it. I'm offering to try. If I fail, fine, but give me a chance." There was something in her tone that quieted the room again. Not defiance, not arrogance, just quiet certainty. Danilo stared at her unsettled. Something in her posture, in her voice, didn't match the uniform. "Fine," he finally spat, tossing the envelope at her like it was garbage. "You've got 5 minutes. Impress us." She caught the documents and opened them with a reverence that no one expected. As her eyes moved across the first page, something shifted. Her fingers stopped trembling. Her lips began to move. "Tisztelt Danilo Souza úr," she began, the Hungarian flowing effortlessly from her lips. "We write to inform you of the legal proceedings regarding the inheritance left by your late uncle, Joseph Souza, who passed away in Budapest on February 15th of this year." The words were smooth, the pronunciation flawless. It didn't sound like she was reading. It sounded like she was remembering. The entire office froze. No one was laughing now. Danilo's mouth hung open, the blood draining from his face. "You're serious," he whispered. "You're actually reading that?" Renata nodded, not taking her eyes off the page. "Your uncle left behind an estate valued at 15 million euros, including real estate and financial assets. As the only surviving heir, you are entitled to claim the full inheritance. However, confirmation must be sent by 6 p.m. today." Gasps rippled through the office like wind. 15 million. Renata looked up, calm as ever. "You have just over 2 hours." Danilo staggered back, gripping the edge of his desk like it might anchor him to reality. How the hell do you know Hungarian?" he asked, voice hoarse. Renata folded the papers neatly and placed them on the desk. "Because I taught it," she said plainly, "for 15 years at the University of São Paulo. Before that, I worked for the Hungarian consulate." The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was shame. The janitor they had all mocked had just become the most important person in the building. Nobody knew where to look. Some employees avoided her gaze entirely, suddenly fascinated by the floor tiles. Others stared at Renata like she was a stranger wearing her uniform. But Danilo just stood there, completely stripped of his bravado. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the woman who scrubbed office bathrooms with the woman who just decoded his €1,000,000 lifeline in a language most Brazilians didn't even know existed. "You were a professor?" he finally asked, still blinking in disbelief. Renata didn't gloat, didn't smile smugly. "Yes, I specialized in Eastern European languages. I also worked as an official translator for the Hungarian consulate." Amanda from finance whispered, "My God." And Mariana took a tentative step forward. Why are you working here?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Renata let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Because 2 years ago I exposed a corruption scheme at the university, professors selling grades and diplomas. I thought I was doing the right thing. They thought I was a threat. She shrugged. I was fired, blacklisted. My husband had just lost his job. My daughter needed expensive medical care. I needed health insurance. So, here I am. That last part landed with a weight that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't some quirky redemption arc. This was survival. Danilo sank into his chair, face buried in his hands. For 2 years he had treated her like she didn't exist, laughed at her, barked orders at her. And now the only person who could save him from blowing a life-changing inheritance was the same woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant. "You're serious about this?" he asked again, grasping at anything familiar in this upside-down moment. Renata nodded. "Very serious. I can translate everything. Not just the letter, but the legal terminology, the forms, the confirmation documents." She paused. "But I'm not doing it for free." Danilo looked up. "You want money?" "No," she said. "You already made an offer. Your monthly salary, $45,000. I'm accepting it." The room went quiet again. It was one thing to call a bluff. It was another to have it called back at you. Danilo hesitated, but the math was simple. 15 million euros against $45,000. There was no comparison. "Fine," he said, swallowing his pride like it was jagged glass. "Just get it done, please." Renata nodded once. "I'll need a computer, internet access, and nobody interrupting me." Danilo turned to Mariana, still stunned. "Clear the meeting room. Get her whatever she needs." As Renata walked to the conference room, a dozen heads turned to watch her. For the first time in that building, people were really seeing her. Not the uniform, not the cart, but the woman. And for the first time in years, Renata felt like herself again. Inside the meeting room, Renata moved with quiet efficiency. Her hands, once accustomed to scrubbing tile and hauling trash bags, now flew confidently across the keyboard. She pulled up translation tools only for formatting. Her knowledge of Hungarian, especially legal terms, was already etched in her memory. She reviewed the original documents carefully, annotating each paragraph with detailed footnotes in Portuguese, ensuring Danilo wouldn't just understand the gist. He'd have the full legal picture. Outside, the office remained abuzz with whispered conversations. No one was working. People passed by the glass walls of the meeting room, sneaking glances at her as if she were some mythical creature conjured from thin air. Mariana brought her water and snacks without being asked. Even Roberto, who had laughed the loudest earlier, lingered near the door, eyes wide with unspoken regret. For Renata, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the money. Not entirely. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she thought the world had buried. For too long, she had become someone she didn't recognize, someone who took abuse in silence. Now, she was back in control of her own narrative. By 4:45 p.m., she stepped out of the room with a stack of printed pages in hand and a thumb drive ready for emailing. The office fell silent as she crossed to Danilo's desk. Danilo looked up, still pale, still uncertain of how to treat her. He stood as she approached, as if instinctively sensing this wasn't just a delivery, this was the moment. "Here," she said, placing the documents on his desk. "Translation is complete. Every paragraph is annotated. I also wrote the formal response you need to send back, in Hungarian, formatted according to their legal standards." Danilo picked up the pages like they were made of glass. He skimmed the first few lines and then just stared. "This is professional," he said quietly. Mariana leaned in. "It looks like something out of an international law firm." Renata nodded. "That's because I've done this exact kind of work hundreds of times. When I worked for the consulate and later when I taught at USP, I handled documents like these weekly." Amanda from finance looked over Danilo's shoulder and gasped. "Is this real? These properties listed here?" Renata pointed to one line. 3 buildings in central Budapest, including a historic hotel, plus the account balance in euros. Danilo's eyes grew wider with each word. He could barely breathe. "It's all real," she said gently. "But you only have until 6 p.m. to confirm and until midnight to send the full response. If you don't, it all reverts to the Hungarian government." Danilo looked at her like he was seeing the sun rise after a lifetime of blindness. He couldn't speak, couldn't even say thank you. But in that moment he knew. He'd never underestimated someone so completely and so wrongly in his life. For the next few minutes, Danilo sat frozen at his desk, scanning the translations over and over, as if afraid they might disappear. Around him, the rest of the office remained still. Renata didn't wait for validation. She simply stood with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. Mariana gently tapped Danilo's shoulder. "Senor, it's 5. You still need to send the documents." That broke his trance. He sprang to action, grabbing his phone and barking into it with renewed urgency. Couriers were summoned, emails sent, printers whirring. But through it all, one truth loomed larger than the inheritance. Danilo had been utterly blind to the value of the woman he'd demeaned for years. And now, that same woman had single-handedly rescued him from what could have been the biggest loss of his life. How did you end up here?" Danilo finally asked, turning to Renata as she packed up her documents. "Someone with your background shouldn't be pushing mops." Renata gave a small shrug. "Life doesn't always give you the job you deserve. Sometimes it gives you the one you need to survive." The room went quiet again. No one dared interrupt. "After I lost my teaching position, nobody would hire me in academia. I had a daughter to support, a husband who was also unemployed, medical bills. I needed stability, a signed work card, health benefits. This job offered all that, so I took it." Amanda stepped closer, a new softness in her voice. "You have a daughter?" "Yes. Sophia. She's 16. Has type 1 diabetes. Needs regular insulin, specialists, constant monitoring. Without this job, she wouldn't have had a health plan," Renata explained. Her voice didn't tremble. It was simply the truth. Roberto, who had joked earlier about learning Hungarian in 5 minutes, looked at his shoes. Mariana placed a hand on Renata's shoulder, unsure of what to say. But Danilo? He sat back in his chair, slowly digesting every word. For the first time, he didn't see Renata as a title or a uniform. He saw a mother, a wife, a fighter. Someone who had taken every hit life threw at her and still showed up to mop the floors of people who looked through her. And now, she had just saved him. "You really could have walked away," Danilo said, almost in a whisper. "You could have let me fail." Renata met his gaze with quiet conviction. "I could have, but I'm not like you." "I don't ignore someone's need just because they ignored mine." It was a punch Danilo didn't know he needed, but it landed clean and deep. There was no ego left in him now, just realization, and maybe, for the first time in a long while, a spark of humility. Danilo stood up slowly, then extended his hand. "I owe you more than money, Renata," he said, voice low, but clear enough for the whole office to hear. "I owe you an apology, for how I treated you, for how I judged you, for everything." There was a visible shift in the room. No one had ever seen Danilo Souza apologize, ever. Not to a client, not to a partner, and certainly not to an employee in a blue cleaning uniform. Renata didn't hesitate. She took his hand briefly, gave it a firm shake, and nodded. "Thank you for acknowledging it." But Danilo wasn't finished. "And I owe you more than the $45,000 I promised. I want to offer you something permanent, a real position here, as our official translation consultant. Salary of $10,000 a month, full benefits, and access to the international division. You'd report directly to me." The office held its breath. Even Renata was momentarily stunned. She'd expected payment for the translation. She had not expected a job offer. "That's generous," she said cautiously, "but I'll need to think about it." Danilo nodded immediately. "Of course, no pressure. Just know that I'd be lucky to have you on the team." As he grabbed the documents and headed for the elevator to deliver them to the courier himself, a murmur spread through the employees left behind. They began to approach Renata one by one, like people waking up from a long dream. Roberto, whose jokes earlier had cut the deepest, stepped forward and rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Hey, Renata, right?" She nodded. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for laughing, for doubting you. That was wrong." Amanda followed. "Me too. I mean, we saw you every day and never asked your name, never thought to know your story." Renata accepted the apologies with grace, though the sudden attention made her visibly uncomfortable. "It's okay," she said. "You don't owe me anything. Just maybe look a little closer next time." Mariana, wiping a tear, wrapped her in a hug. "I'm proud of you, Renata. You reminded all of us that dignity doesn't wear a name tag." As Renata stood in the middle of the office, receiving apology after apology, she couldn't help but reflect on how surreal the moment was. Just that morning, she was invisible. Now the same people who mocked her were showing remorse. But more than that, respect. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel like the janitor. She felt like the woman she used to be, the woman she still was. And somehow, even though she hadn't planned on it, she began to believe that maybe she didn't have to choose between survival and dignity anymore. Maybe she could finally have both. By the time Danilo returned from the courier, sweating and slightly out of breath, it was already 6:20 p.m. The deadline had been met by mere minutes, but it didn't matter. Renata had done her job with absolute precision, and the documents were now en route to Budapest. "It's done," Danilo announced as he walked back into the office. His voice shaky but relieved. "Confirmed delivery. They'll arrive first thing tomorrow morning." A small cheer erupted from a few employees, but most still looked toward Renata. She was still standing near the break room, clutching her bag as if unsure what to do next. Danilo approached her directly this time. "Renata, about the job offer. Have you had a chance to think about it?" She looked up at him. This time, not as an employee, but as an equal. "Yes, I have. And I'd like to accept. But I have 3 conditions." Danilo raised his eyebrows but didn't interrupt. "First," she continued, "I want to keep working part-time for the next 2 weeks so I can train my replacement in the cleaning staff. I won't leave them short-staffed." Danilo nodded slowly. "That's considerate." "Agreed." "Second," she said, "my salary should be deposited directly into the clinic's account where my daughter receives treatment. I don't want delays or complications." "Of course," Danilo replied, now visibly humbled. "And third," she added, "I want a written contract that outlines everything. Responsibilities, rights, protections. I don't want ambiguity later." Danilo extended his hand again. "Deal." The next morning, Renata showed up at the office at her usual time, 7:06 a.m., but for the first time, she wasn't wearing her janitor's uniform. She wore a crisp white blouse, black trousers, and carried a slim briefcase. Paula at reception nearly did a double take. "Good morning, Renata," she said with a smile. "You look amazing." Renata smiled back, still adjusting to being seen. "Thank you. I'm here to finalize the contract with Mr. Danilo." Paula beamed. "He's expecting you. And everyone's been talking about what happened yesterday. Your story is incredible." Renata took a seat in the waiting area, feeling the strange sensation of being a guest in a place where she had always felt invisible. Danilo arrived 30 minutes early. When he saw her, he smiled, not the smug grin of before, but something more grounded. "Shall we?" he asked. Upstairs, Mariana had already prepared the documents. "All the terms are here," she said, handing Renata the printed contract, "and the legal team is ready to make any edits you need." Renata sat down, read every word carefully, made a few notes, and signed. Danilo countersigned without hesitation. "Welcome to the team," he said. But Renata wasn't done. "One more thing. Did we receive a confirmation from Budapest yet?" Danilo grinned. "Yes, just this morning. The law firm said it was the cleanest, most professional translation they'd seen. They even asked if you're available for more work." Renata smiled, this time letting herself feel proud. "Tell them I'm open to consulting, but only if they're punctual. I'm very busy these days." Throughout the day, Renata was introduced formally to every department. Each team member greeted her with a mix of awe and genuine respect, struggling to reconcile the version of her they had known with the one standing confidently in front of them now. In every handshake and nod, there was an unspoken apology. At 10 a.m., Danilo received a call from the Budapest law firm handling the inheritance. Mariana buzzed his line. "Senor Danilo, there's a Mr. Kovacs on the line. He says it's urgent." Danilo picked up the phone immediately, and after a few minutes of broken English and legal terms he couldn't fully grasp, he waved at Renata through the glass partition. "Can you come in here? I need help." Renata entered and picked up the second line. For the next 20 minutes she translated seamlessly, switching between legalese and natural Hungarian, making notes and clarifying procedures. When she hung up, her expression was serious. "There's been a complication," she said. "3 other individuals have come forward claiming ties to your uncle. They're challenging the validity of your inheritance." Danilo's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? I thought this was settled." "Apparently not. We're going to need to prove your legal claim beyond just the letter. They want additional documentation, and possibly witnesses." She paused. "And we may have to go to Budapest." Danilo blinked rapidly. "Go? Like, fly there? But I don't speak the language. I don't know anything about their system. Exactly, she said. That's why I'd go with you, if you want me to. Danilo leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of a million things he didn't understand. Budapest, legal battles, foreign courts. He shook his head. That's crazy. Flights, hotels, attorneys. How much would all this cost? Renata didn't hesitate. A few thousand probably, but you're talking about 15 million euros. It's not an expense, Danilo. It's an investment in not losing everything. He rubbed his temples, torn between panic and logic. And if we go, you'd help me with all of it? Yes, she said, but not for free. I want 5% of whatever you keep after the hearing. That's fair for an international legal consultant, and far less than most lawyers would charge. Danilo did the math. Even if he had to give her a full million rees, he'd still walk away with more money than he'd ever dreamed. More than enough to expand the company, secure his family's future, and live comfortably for the rest of his life. Okay, he said finally, extending his hand again. You've got yourself a deal. Renata nodded and took it. Good. Then we've got a lot to prepare. Starting with your passport and getting the right documents shipped from Sao Paulo. Within minutes, the office turned into a whirlwind of activity. Mariana called travel agents. Roberto helped rush the passport paperwork. Amanda rearranged Danilo's schedule. And at the center of it all was Renata, coordinating, calling Budapest, emailing legal teams. The woman who used to mop their floors now ran the most important operation the company had ever seen. The following night, Danilo and Renata boarded a flight from Sao Paulo to Frankfurt, with a connection to Budapest. Danilo was clearly on edge the entire time, tapping his foot, fidgeting with the seatbelt, glancing at his phone every few seconds like it might deliver some miracle. Renata, by contrast, was composed. She reviewed legal documents on a tablet, highlighted key terms, and made annotations in Hungarian. She even found time to rest. It wasn't just that she was fluent in the language. It was that she understood the system, the culture, the rhythm of a place Danilo had never even seen on a map before that week. Have you ever been to Budapest before? He asked at one point, trying to make conversation as the plane cruised at altitude. Several times, she replied without looking up. I was part of Brazil's diplomatic delegation in my early career. Worked on several inheritance disputes just like this one. This isn't new to me. Danilo didn't respond. He was still trying to process how the woman who used to clean under his desk now carried more expertise than most people he'd ever hired. When they landed, it was mid-afternoon local time. Waiting at the airport was Andras Kovacs, a well-dressed Hungarian attorney in his 50s with silver hair and a sharp jawline. He greeted Renata like an old friend. Renata, it's been too long. You look well. She smiled, responding in fluent Hungarian before introducing Danilo. This is the heir we've come to defend. On the drive into the city, Andras explained the situation in more detail. There are 3 challengers, he said in clear, accented English. 2 distant cousins and a woman who claims to have been Joseph's common-law wife. The issue is timing. If they file before the court recognizes your claim, it complicates everything. Danilo's brow furrowed. But I'm his actual nephew. Isn't that enough? Renata, seated beside him in the back seat, responded before Andras could. In Brazil, probably. But Hungarian inheritance law allows extended family and life partners to contest a will if they believe they were unfairly excluded. Emotional testimony matters here. Documentation matters more. She turned to Andras. Did the challengers submit any hard evidence? He nodded. A few documents, but mostly testimony. Their goal is to delay, to force a negotiation. Danilo exhaled. Great. So they want to shake me down. Possibly, Andras said. But if we build the right narrative and back it with strong legal documents, we can shut them down before it gains traction. Renata looked out the window at the narrow Budapest streets, the Gothic buildings casting long shadows on the cobblestone roads. We'll need Joseph's most recent will, originals if possible, and any supporting evidence that he intended to leave everything to Danilo. Andras nodded. Already requested. We're scheduled at the civil court tomorrow morning. Danilo closed his eyes. The thought of stepping into a foreign courtroom terrified him. But then he glanced at Renata, focused, calm, already preparing for battle, and felt, for the first time in days, a sliver of hope. The next morning, just as the sun rose over the rooftops of Budapest, Danilo found himself in front of the city's central civil court. a stately stone building with tall columns and imposing steps that made him feel even smaller than he already did. Dressed in his best suit, he fidgeted with his tie while Renata calmly reviewed their folder of evidence. She moved with precision, organizing every document by category: wills, birth certificates, notarized translations, and a family tree diagram that visually traced Danilo's bloodline directly to Joseph. "Remember," she said, glancing at him as they waited in the hallway, "you don't need to impress anyone. Just answer honestly when asked. Let the documentation and strategy do the work." He nodded, but his nerves were palpable. Inside the courtroom, 3 judges presided over a long table, with the claimants seated opposite Danilo and Renata. On one side sat Esther Nagy, a severe-looking woman in her 50s who claimed to have been Joseph's partner. Next to her were the 2 distant cousins, Bela and Mirali Kovacs, both looking uncomfortable in their cheap suits. The proceedings began in Hungarian. Renata translated everything for Danilo in real time, whispering efficiently while still listening intently to the others. The opposing lawyers presented their arguments, painting Esther as the devoted companion and the cousins as family wronged by oversight. But when it was their turn, Renata stood with Andras and presented their case. They began with the DNA evidence, which Renata had smartly secured back in Brazil through her contacts at the consulate. It matched Danilo conclusively to Joseph's family line. Then came the latest will, dated just 3 months before Joseph's death, where he clearly stated his desire for all his assets to go to "my nephew in Brazil, Danilo Souza, the only family I regret losing touch with." The court grew visibly attentive. Renata handed over 3 notarized copies, complete with Hungarian legal seals and translations. The cousins fidgeted. Esther's lawyer objected, claiming the will could have been signed under emotional distress. Renata anticipated this. "We also have 3 witnesses," she said calmly. "Neighbors of Joseph who saw him in good health weeks before his death and who recall him speaking proudly of reconnecting with his family in Brazil." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are the witnesses present?" "2 are here today," Andras confirmed. The 3rd sent a notarized affidavit. One by one, the witnesses were brought in. Elderly Hungarians who spoke softly but confidently. They described Joseph fondly, recalling his late life joy at tracing his Brazilian roots. The final piece came in the form of a handwritten letter Joseph had started but never sent, addressed to Danilo. "Dear nephew," it began, "you may not know me, but I've always wondered about the family my brother left behind." When Renata translated it aloud, Danilo felt his throat close up. It was the first time he had felt any emotional connection to this uncle he'd never met, and judging by the court's silence, he wasn't the only one moved. As the final words of Joseph's unfinished letter echoed through the courtroom, the energy in the room shifted. Even the judges, typically reserved, exchanged glances that hinted at empathy. Esther's lawyer rose again in a last-ditch attempt to cast doubt, questioning the legitimacy of the will's execution and whether Joseph had been manipulated. But Renata was ready. The will was signed in the presence of a notary public and 2 independent witnesses, she stated firmly. All documentation has been verified by the Hungarian consulate in Brazil and registered in compliance with Hungarian succession law. The judges nodded, flipping through the bundle of legal papers that Renata and Andras had provided. The cousin's lawyer followed suit with a weaker protest, insisting that Joseph had mentioned plans to leave something for his extended family. But with no will, no formal arrangement, and contradictory statements from their witnesses, their argument fell apart under scrutiny. At one point, one of the cousins misspoke under questioning, contradicting a prior statement about the date of their last visit with Joseph. It was a small crack, but it was enough. Renata leaned toward Danilo and whispered, "This is going better than expected." He gave her a tight nod, still overwhelmed, but slowly realizing just how deep her expertise ran. She wasn't just his translator. She was his strategist, his advocate, his lifeline. The judges called a recess to deliberate. Danilo and Renata waited in a side hallway, seated on a stiff wooden bench. Danilo bounced his leg anxiously while Renata remained still, her posture erect and composed. "How do you stay so calm?" he finally asked. "Because I've done this before," she replied without ego. "And because worrying never changed the outcome of anything." Danilo looked down at his hands. "I keep thinking about how I almost didn't give you a chance. If you hadn't spoken up." He trailed off, ashamed. "You weren't ready to see me," Renata said, her voice soft but steady. "People only see what they think they're allowed to see, And in your world, someone like me didn't belong. She didn't say it with resentment, just clarity. But now that you've seen, you can't unsee. Danilo swallowed hard. I'm sorry. For everything. Renata turned to him, her expression kind. You've already begun to change. That's more than most people ever do. Moments later, a court officer emerged and called them back in. The judges had reached a decision. As they re-entered the courtroom, Danilo's heart pounded like a drum. But beside him, Renata walked forward with the quiet strength of someone who knew, deep down, that truth, backed by preparation, rarely lost. The presiding judge adjusted his glasses, his expression neutral as he reviewed the stack of papers once more. Everyone in the courtroom leaned forward, tension pressing down on every shoulder. After careful examination of the submitted documents, testimonies, and legal declarations, he began in Hungarian, his tone deliberate. This court finds that Danilo Souza, nephew of the deceased Joseph Souza, is the rightful heir to the estate in question. Renata translated quietly but clearly into Danilo's ear, and when the words finally landed, he froze. He couldn't even react. It took a full beat before the realization truly hit. They had won. The contesting claims from the parties Esther Nagy, Bella Kovacs, and Morali Kovacs, the judge continued, are found to be either insufficiently supported or in contradiction with verified evidence. The gavel came down once, sharp and final. The decision was done. Esther let out a sharp breath that sounded like a suppressed scream. The cousins stood in stunned silence, their lawyers already turning to gather their papers in defeat. Danilo turned to Renata, eyes wide, still in disbelief. She smiled, a real, soft smile, and gave him a gentle nod. It's over, she whispered. You're officially the heir. Back at the hotel that night, Danilo sat by the window of his suite overlooking the Danube, the glowing lights of Budapest flickering on the river's surface like fragments of a dream. He still couldn't wrap his head around the past 48 hours. From utter panic and arrogance to gratitude and humility, it felt like a lifetime had passed. Renata was across the room, typing quietly on her laptop, sending final confirmation emails to the Hungarian lawyers, and beginning the process of transferring the estate to his name. Danilo watched her for a moment. Can I ask you something? He said finally. She looked up. Of course. Why'd you do all this? I mean, I treated you horribly. You didn't owe me anything. Renata took a breath. Because I don't believe in letting people drown when I know how to swim. Because I knew what this opportunity could mean for you. And because, despite everything, I don't believe kindness should be selective. She closed the laptop and added, and let's be honest, Danilo, you offered me 5%. He chuckled, the tension finally giving way to something lighter. Yeah, I guess I did. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. He knew that. She knew it too. This trip had transformed more than just bank accounts. It had cracked open old prejudices, exposed buried truths, and planted something new in both of them. Respect. Real, earned, irreversible respect. 3 months after returning from Budapest, Danilo's office looked entirely different, physically and spiritually. The company had moved to a larger space, expanding across 3 floors, thanks to the multi-million-euro inheritance now officially in his possession. But more than the shiny new furniture or the upgraded tech, it was the energy that had shifted. Employees walked with a new sense of belonging. Conversations felt less guarded, and for the first time in company history, Danilo had implemented a policy of transparency and equity across departments. At the heart of this transformation was Renata. No longer the invisible janitor in a blue uniform, she now held the title of Director of International Affairs, drawing a salary that reflected not only her talent, but the trust Danilo now placed in her. Her office was modest but functional, filled with books in 5 languages and legal manuals bookmarked with colorful tabs. That morning, as she entered the boardroom carrying folders translated in Hungarian and German, Danilo looked up from the head of the table and smiled. Everything ready for the investor presentation? He asked. Fully translated and summarized, she replied, handing him a condensed Portuguese version for the local board. Also, Budapest sent over a few more cases. 2 Brazilian families dealing with inheritance claims. They want our help. Danilo blinked. They requested us? Renata nodded. More specifically, they requested me. He laughed, shaking his head. Well, they've got good taste. Then, leaning back, he added, actually, I was thinking, what if we opened a new department? International succession and legal consulting. You'd run it. Renata paused mid-step. You're serious? Dead serious. We've already proven we can handle complex international cases, and your reputation is growing like wildfire. Budapest says you're one of the best they've worked with. I say we build on that. Renata took a moment to absorb it. A year ago, she was cleaning smudges off the glass doors of this same company, trying not to be seen. Now she was being offered the reins to an entire division. We'd need a small team, she said, already thinking logistically. At least 5 people, ideally multilingual, with experience in civil law and international relations. Done, Danilo replied. Talk to HR. We'll make it happen. Just then, Mariana entered the room with a large floral arrangement. This just arrived for you, she said, placing it on Renata's desk. From the Kovacs firm in Budapest, with a handwritten note. Renata opened the card and smiled. They want me as a permanent consultant for their Latin American cases. Danilo shook his head with a laugh. From janitor to internationally sought-after consultant. If someone made a movie about this, nobody would believe it. Renata met his gaze and smiled. Good thing we're not in a movie then. Just real life. Messy, surprising, and sometimes poetic in its own way. It wasn't just Renata's professional life that transformed. It was her family's future too. Her husband, Carlos, once a laid-off engineer working long shifts as a rideshare driver, had recently been hired as a logistics coordinator in Danilo's company. The position came with benefits, stability, and, for the first time in years, a schedule that allowed him to be home for dinner. More importantly, their daughter Sofia had begun her first semester at the University of São Paulo, ironically, the same university where her mother had once taught. She'd been accepted into the medical program with top scores and a full scholarship funded through the company's new education fund for employees' children, an initiative Danilo launched after returning from Hungary. That Friday afternoon, the office buzzed with more excitement than usual. A group had gathered near the reception, clapping and hugging. Danilo, hearing the commotion, stepped out of his office just in time to see Renata's phone light up and her face dissolve into tears. What's going on? He asked, concern in his voice. Mariana, already teary-eyed herself, answered, Sofia just got her results. First place. Top of her class in the entire medical school entrance exam. The office burst into applause. Someone brought cake from the break room. Someone else pulled out their phone to take pictures. Renata stood in the middle, overwhelmed, caught between disbelief and pride. And for a moment, everything stopped. Every sacrifice, every late shift, every moment of doubt was replaced by something radiant. Danilo approached her quietly, handing her a glass of sparkling juice someone had poured. To your daughter, he said, lifting his own glass. And to you, for being the kind of mother who never gave up, even when the world gave up on her. Renata clinked her glass with his, eyes still wet. She's going to be the first doctor in our family, she said. My father was a bricklayer. My mother cleaned houses. We never thought something like this was possible. It was possible, Danilo said, because she has you. Nearby, Sofia had arrived to surprise her mother in person. She ran through the office, still in her school uniform, and flung her arms around Renata with a joyful scream. Mãe, I did it! Renata laughed through her tears, hugging her tightly. You did, meu amor. You did. Carlos arrived minutes later, beaming with pride as he embraced them both. Danilo stepped back, giving them space, but his heart swelled, watching the scene. This was what legacy looked like. Not just euros in a foreign bank, but a chain of events that changed lives, shifted destinies, restored dignity. Looking around at his staff, some cheering, some crying, all smiling, he realized that the company wasn't just more successful now, it was more human. And it all started because one woman, whom no one bothered to know, had chosen to speak up and offer help when no one else could. Weeks later, during the company's monthly all-hands meeting, Danilo stood at the front of the auditorium, looking out at the employees who had once watched him bark orders and throw tantrums. The transformation wasn't lost on them. The once unapproachable CEO now spoke with a steadier voice, with pauses that let gratitude breathe. Before we wrap up today, he said, glancing at Renata in the front row, I want to share something important. The room quieted. 3 months ago, I almost lost 15 million euros. Not because of a bad investment, but because of arrogance. My own. He scanned the crowd. I dismissed someone who stood right in front of me for years, someone who I assumed had no value beyond the job title on her badge. He looked directly at Renata. That person turned out to be the most capable, intelligent, and dignified individual I've ever had the privilege to work with. She didn't just save a business deal. She saved me from being the kind of man I never want to be again. The room was still. Then he added, and because of that, I've decided to make some permanent changes. A few curious murmurs rippled through the audience. Starting next quarter, Danilo continued, 15% of this company's profits will be equally distributed among all employees, regardless of title, position, or tenure. Gasps filled the room. I don't care if you're in the boardroom or cleaning the break room. If you're part of this company's success, you'll share in it. Someone stood and clapped. Others followed. Soon the entire room was on their feet, cheering, applauding not just the money, but the meaning behind it. Danilo raised a hand for quiet again. That's not all, he said. We're also launching a scholarship fund for children of our employees. No more dreams cut short because of lack of money. Tears welled up in more than a few eyes, including Sophia's, who sat beside her mother, now proudly watching from the crowd. When the applause died down, Danilo stepped off the stage and made his way to Renata. You changed this place, he said, and you changed me. She looked up, emotional but composed. Sometimes people just need a chance to see the truth. You gave me that chance after I insisted on it. He laughed gently. Yeah, you didn't really give me a choice. She grinned. That's how life works. Some truths demand to be heard, whether people are ready or not. Months passed, and Renata's story became something of a legend, not just within the company, but beyond it. Articles were written. A local news outlet ran a segment titled, "The Janitor Who Spoke 5 Languages and Saved a Fortune." Emails poured in from university students, from women in similar roles, from people who felt invisible and suddenly found hope in her journey. She responded to every single one, never from a place of superiority, but as a peer, someone who understood, someone who had been there. And though she was now a respected executive, Renata never fully left behind the woman who once scrubbed the halls at dawn. Every Friday, she still took 10 minutes to stop by the cleaning staff's break room, sit for a coffee, and check in, not as their boss, but as someone who remembered how lonely that room could feel. She would ask about their children, bring leftover snacks from board meetings, and make sure their names were known beyond the ID cards they wore. It was this simple act, repeated week after week, that redefined the company's culture more than any policy Danilo ever wrote, because it proved that visibility, true human recognition, wasn't a perk, it was a necessity. And in the quiet moments, after the meetings, the media attention, the applauses, Renata often found herself reflecting on the randomness of it all. One sealed envelope, one overheard announcement, one choice to speak up. It could have gone unnoticed. She could have stayed silent, but she didn't, because dignity, once lost, claws its way back in small acts of defiance, in truth, in service, in the relentless belief that no uniform defines your worth, that even in a world that tries to erase your story, you have the right to write it back. On a sunny afternoon, sitting on a park bench near her daughter's university, Renata watched Sophia laugh with classmates, a stethoscope peeking from her backpack, and smiled to herself. She no longer needed to prove who she was. The world had finally seen her, and more importantly, she had never stopped seeing herself.